When my own daughter told me to take my Thanksgiving plate to the kitchen because the real family sat at the main table, I didn't raise my voice. I am Yolanda Vance, a 68-year-old retired county title clerk, and I simply walked out. They forgot that the very roof over their heads was held together by my signature. I know some of you listening to my voice right now have sat at a holiday table feeling like an uninvited ghost in a home you sacrificed your youth to build. You quiet your own breathing so you don't disturb the joy of people who only value you for what you can give, not who you are. If you've ever felt that cold draft of rejection from your own flesh and blood, I want you to sit tight with me. This story is for you. The air in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina gets crisp around late November, the kind of cold that crawls right into your joints if you aren't careful. For 35 years, I walked up the marble steps of the Watauga County Courthouse carrying heavy canvas-bound deed registers. My fingers have traced every property line, easement, and boundary dispute in this county. I earned my pension the hard way, with discount orthopedics on my feet, a thermos of black coffee, and a dedication to detail that most people these days don't have the patience for. When my husband, Arthur, passed away 20 years ago, leaving me with a mortgage and a teenage daughter, I didn't curl up. I put on my coat, packed my lunch in a worn Tupperware bowl that smelled of bologna and mustard, and went to work. My daughter, Chloe, was my whole world. I made sure she had the life I never did. I paid for her college, her car, and her wedding by pinching pennies until they screamed. But somewhere along the line, Chloe started looking at my sensible shoes and my small rented duplex with something resembling pity. Then, that pity turned into embarrassment. It got worse when she married Brandon. Brandon is the son of a local high-end developer, a man who wears pastel polo shirts with the collars turned up and talks in real estate buzzwords like synergy and curb appeal. Brandon's mother, Victoria, is a woman who smells of expensive French lavender and condescension. She treats local folks like background scenery in her grand life. To Victoria, I was just the sweet little clerk who used to stamp the papers. 2 years ago, Chloe and Brandon wanted to build their dream home, a massive modern farmhouse with black window frames and wrapping porches, the kind you see on television. They had the design, but they didn't have the land, and they certainly didn't have the credit to secure the construction loan they needed. That was when they came to my small kitchen table, looking like two lost children. "Mom," Chloe had pleaded, reaching across the oilcloth tablecloth to take my hands. "You have those 6 acres on the ridge that Dad left you, the ones overlooking the valley. If you put the deed in our names, we can get the construction loan. We'll build a beautiful house, and there's a mother-in-law suite right over the garage. You'll never have to worry about rent again. We'll be together, a real family." I felt a pang of worry back then. But when your only daughter looks at you with wet eyes, your brain sometimes ignores what your gut is screaming. Still, 35 years of title work teaches you never to sign anything without reading the fine print. I didn't just hand over the land. I had my old friend and attorney, Frank Miller, draw up a very specific, very ironclad deed. I signed the property over to them, yes, but with a life estate reservation and a restrictive covenant that Brandon's slick lawyers didn't bother to scrutinize because they thought I was just an old woman eager to please. They built the house. It was beautiful, gleaming with white paint and expensive quartz countertops. But the mother-in-law suite over the garage? It quickly became Brandon's executive home office. I was relegated to a small guest room in the basement next to the water heater. I didn't complain. I kept my head down, washed their dishes, folded their laundry, and swept the hardwood floors. Which brings us to this Thanksgiving. The house was filled with the rich, savory aroma of the 20-pound turkey I had spent the last 24 hours prepping, brining, and roasting. I made the yeast rolls from scratch, kneading the dough until my arthritic wrists throbbed. I peeled 20 pounds of potatoes, my hands stained gray from the starch. Chloe had spent the morning taking photos of the table centerpiece for her social media, posing with a linen dish towel over her shoulder as if she had been the one sweating over the stove. By 4 o'clock, the guests had arrived. Victoria was there, draped in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked entirely impractical for a dinner involving gravy. She sat on the plush sofa, holding court, while Brandon poured her expensive wine. My only comfort in that house was my 15-year-old grandson, Leo. Leo is Chloe's son from a brief youthful marriage before she met Brandon. Leo is a quiet boy, a bit of an outcast in his own home now that Chloe and Brandon have a perfect new 3-year-old toddler together. Leo wears oversized black hoodies and keeps to himself, but he has a heart of absolute gold. He was the only one who came into the kitchen to help me. "Need me to mash the potatoes, Grandma?" he asked quietly, standing by the stove. "I'd love that, sweetheart," I said, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. "Your hands are stronger than mine today." We worked in tandem, a quiet rhythm of mashing, stirring, and plating. When it was time to sit down, the dining room looked like a magazine spread. The long, dark wood table was set with 12 glittering places. I washed my hands, smoothed down my best floral blouse, and walked into the dining room. I carried the heavy ceramic bowl of sweet potato casserole, my signature dish. As I approached the table, looking for an empty chair, I noticed something. There were exactly 11 chairs. Victoria was seated at the head, Brandon at the other. Chloe was in the middle, next to her toddler's high chair. Brandon's wealthy friends from the country club occupied the rest of the seats. There was no place for me. "Oh," Chloe said, her voice dropping into that high-pitched, performative tone she uses when she's embarrassed. She didn't look me in the eye. She looked at Victoria, then at Brandon. "Mom, we're a little tight on space at the main table. And well, Victoria's friends are here, and we have some business things to discuss." The room went dead silent. The clinking of wine glasses stopped. "I can grab a folding chair from the closet, Chloe," I said softly, holding the hot casserole dish with quilted oven mitts. "I don't mind squeezing in." "Actually, Mom," Chloe said, her voice hardening, losing its fake warmth. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress. She looked at me with a cold, dismissive glare that sliced right through my chest. "You can eat in the kitchen. The real family sits here. Honestly, you'll be more comfortable in there anyway. It's closer to the stove if things need warming up." The words hung in the air, like heavy, suffocating smoke. "The real family sits here." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had carried on my hip, the girl whose feverish forehead I had bathed with cool cloths in the dead of night, the girl for whom I had skipped meals so she could have brand-name sneakers. Beside her, Victoria took a delicate sip of her wine, a small, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Brandon looked away, pretending to be deeply interested in his napkin. But it was Leo's face that broke my heart. The poor boy was sitting near the end of the table, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork. He looked at his mother with utter disgust, then looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. "Grandma," Leo whispered, starting to stand up. "You can have my seat. I'll go to the kitchen." "Sit down, Leo," Brandon snapped, his voice sharp. "Don't make a scene." I stood there for 3 long seconds. In my 35 years at the county registry, I have seen people lose their tempers, scream, cry, and throw tantrums over a few inches of dirt. I learned a long time ago that anger is a weak position. Silence, combined with the law, is where the real power lies. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I walked over to the buffet server, set the sweet potato casserole down with a soft, deliberate clack, and took off my oven mitts. I folded them neatly, placing them next to the dish. "Yolanda?" Chloe called out, her voice suddenly laced with a tiny thread of nervous tension. "Are you going to get your plate?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw the senior title clerk who had stared down corrupt developers and arrogant politicians. "No, Chloe," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and perfectly clear. "I'm not." I turned on my heel, walked out of the dining room, and went down to the basement. I grabbed my scratchy wool coat, my purse, and my car keys. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't need to. As I walked out the front door into the freezing mountain air, I heard the heavy oak door click shut behind me. I got into my 12-year-old Subaru, turned the heater on high, and drove down the winding mountain road, leaving the glowing $1 million farmhouse behind me. I drove straight to my small, quiet rented duplex in town. I hadn't let the lease go, despite Chloe's constant nagging. I kept it, just in case. My gut had been right all along. I walked inside, turned on the single lamp by my favorite armchair, and filled the kettle. The house was cold, but it was mine. It was peaceful. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat down at my worn pine table, and looked at the heavy brass desk embosser sitting on the shelf, the one I had kept as a retirement souvenir from the county. I pulled my phone out of my purse and set it on the table. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I knew the precise legal mechanism I had put in place 2 years ago. And as the clock on the wall ticked towards 7, I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited. The radiator in my little duplex gave a familiar, comforting hiss as the steam began to circulate. I didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, I clicked on the small brass pharmacy lamp next to my armchair, casting a warm, amber glow across the worn linoleum of my kitchen. If you've ever sat in the quiet of your own home after being discarded by the people you love most, you know that the silence doesn't feel empty at first. It feels heavy. It feels like a physical weight pressing down on your shoulders, asking you if you're finally ready to break. I sat there in my wool coat, my hands wrapped around that faded yellow stoneware mug, the one with the hairline crack near the handle that I just could never bring myself to throw away. And I let myself feel the sting. I'm not made of stone. I am a mother. When Chloe told me that the real family sat at the table, a part of me, the part that still remembers her as a chubby-cheeked toddler scraping her knees on the sidewalk, wanted to drop to my knees and beg her to love me. It's a terrible thing admitting that to you. But if we aren't honest about our weaknesses, our strength doesn't mean much, does it? I let 2 tears, hot and slow, slide down my cheeks. I let them fall right into my black coffee, and then I wiped my face with a paper napkin, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air of my clean kitchen, and stood up. It was time to go to work. I walked over to the small hallway closet where I kept my utility items and my old professional life. Sitting on the bottom shelf, right next to a stack of vintage quilting squares, was a heavy olive-green metal filing cabinet. I reached into my purse, pulled out my key ring, and found the tiny, flat brass key with the faded red plastic tab. I'd kept that key safe for decades. When I unlocked the drawer, the scent of old paper and dried lavender sachet drifted up to meet me. For 35 years at the Watauga County Courthouse, I lived in the world of paper. People think digital files are the ultimate truth, but let me tell you something. Hard drives crash, servers get wiped, but paper, thick, heavy bond paper with a wet ink signature and a raised notary seal. That is what stands the test of time. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder labeled Ridge Property, Conveyance and Covenants. I brought it back to the pine table, smoothing the cover with my palm. This wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. My late husband, Arthur, bought those 6 acres back in 1978. He was a shift supervisor at the old Thomasville furniture plant, working 60 hours a week in the heat and the sawdust until his lungs whistled when he breathed. Every spare dollar we had went into saving for that land. We used to drive up there on Sunday afternoons in his old Chevy pickup, sit on the tailgate with a thermos of sweet tea, and watch the sun dip below the Blue Ridge line. "Yolanda," he'd say, his hand rough and calloused over mine, "this dirt is our anchor. No matter what happens in this crazy world, if you've got your name on a deed, you've got a place to stand." When Arthur died, I promised myself I would protect that anchor, and I did until my love for my daughter made me weak. 2 years ago, when Chloe and Brandon sat at this very table begging for the land, Brandon had brought along his family's attorney, a slick young man in a $3,000 suit who kept calling me ma'am in a way that felt like he was patting me on the head. They had a standard warranty deed ready for me to sign. They wanted me to sign over the entire 6 acres, free and clear, so they could use the land as collateral for a massive $1.2 million construction to permanent loan. But I hadn't spent 35 years examining county land records just to be outsmarted by a boy who still had his college meal card in his wallet. I had politely declined to sign their papers that day. Instead, I took a trip to see Frank Miller. Frank's office was located right above the old hardware store on Main Street. It smelled of peppermint candy, floor wax, and leather-bound law books from the 1970s. Frank was retired from active trial work, but he still kept his notary stamp and his license active just to help old friends like me. "Yolanda," Frank had said, leaning back in his squeaky leather chair and sucking on a peppermint, "you want to help your girl? I get it. But Brandon's daddy is a developer. They know how to squeeze people out. If you hand over that deed, They can put you in a corner and you won't have a leg to stand on. Then we build the legs, Frank, I had told him. Together, we drafted a highly customized document, a conditional deed of gift with reservation of life estate and right of reversion. I opened the manila folder and looked at the document now. The language was beautiful in its precision. I ran my index finger over the raised, textured gold seal of the notary. The deed stated that I conveyed the 6 acres to Chloe and Brandon, subject to a lifetime occupancy right, a life estate, in my favor. But Frank and I didn't stop there. We inserted a very specific restrictive covenant. It stated that the grantees were required to construct, maintain, and provide for my exclusive, uninterrupted use a separate, self-contained residential unit of no less than 800 square feet on the property. And here was the steel trap. The deed contained a condition, subsequent with an automatic right of reverter. If the grantees failed to provide said residential unit, or if they altered, converted, or restricted my access to my designated living space without my express, written, and notarized consent, or if they engaged in constructive eviction, which the document defined as making the property uninhabitable or hostile to my continued residency, the conveyance would immediately become null and void. Upon written notice of violation, the entire title to the 6 acres, including all structures built upon it, would automatically revert to me, Yolanda Vance, in fee simple absolute. But here is the kicker, the part that Brandon's slick bank lawyers had missed because they were in such a hurry to close the loan before the end of the fiscal quarter. Brandon and Chloe's construction loan was contingent upon them holding clear and unencumbered title to the land. Under the terms of their mortgage, any cloud on the title, any dispute over ownership, or any reversion of the land would trigger an immediate default. The bank would have the right to accelerate the loan, demanding the entire $1.2 million be paid in full within 30 days. And if they couldn't pay, the bank would foreclose, not just on the house, but on Brandon's family business, which had personally guaranteed the note. I had lived in the basement next to the noisy water heater for a year. I had watched Brandon turn my beautiful garage apartment into his executive lounge, complete with a leather sofa and a wet bar. I had held my tongue when they moved my sewing machine and my mother's cedar chest down into the damp cellar. I had waited, hoping my daughter would remember who I was, hoping she would look at me and see her mother, not a servant. Tonight, she had made her choice. She had drawn the line in the sand, and she had put me on the outside of it. I picked up my landline phone. I still prefer the corded phone in the kitchen when I have real business to conduct, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a sleepy, gravelly voice answered. "Hello? Frank?" I said quietly. "It's Yolanda." There was a brief pause, the sound of a blanket shifting, and then Frank's voice cleared, instantly sharp. "Yolanda, it's Thanksgiving. Are you all right? Did they—" "They did, Frank," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Chloe told me to eat in the kitchen. She told me the real family sits at the table. And Brandon locked the basement door from the inside when I went down to get my coat. I had to use the exterior storm stairs to leave." I heard Frank let out a long, low whistle. "Constructive eviction. Clear as mountain water. They locked you out of your primary access to the structure, and they've been occupying your designated life estate suite as an office for over a year. I have the utility bills I paid for the suite, the photos of Brandon's office setup, and the letter they sent me last month asking me to consider moving my things to a storage unit," I said. "And tonight, I have my grandson, Leo, who witnessed the whole thing." "You want me to pull the trigger, Yolanda?" Frank asked. His voice wasn't warm anymore. It was the voice of a seasoned attorney who had spent 40 years defending the working folks of this county from greedy land grabbers. "Pull it, Frank," I said. "File the notice of reverter. Send the digital copy to the escrow agent at Piedmont Trust and carbon copy the regional vice president. Let's let them know who owns the dirt under their feet." "I'll have it in their secure portal in 10 minutes, Frank said. Piedmont Trust has an automated compliance system for high-value construction loans. The second, a notice of reverter on the collateral land is filed, their system flags it. Their legal department will be burning up the phone lines before the turkey is cold." "Thank you, Frank." Don't thank me, Yolanda. Arthur worked too hard for that mountain. You enjoy your coffee. I hung up the receiver. The kitchen was quiet again, save for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the oak schoolhouse clock on the wall. I sat back down in my armchair, picked up my stoneware mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was lukewarm now, but I didn't mind. I looked at my cell phone sitting on the table. It was exactly 6:45 in the evening. For 35 years, I had watched people try to cut corners, try to take what wasn't theirs because they thought they were smarter, faster, or richer than the law. But the law doesn't care about your cashmere sweater, and it doesn't care about your country club friends. The law cares about what is written down. I closed my eyes and waited. At precisely 7:15, the silence of my kitchen was shattered. My cell phone on the table began to vibrate, its screen lighting up with a photo of Chloe and Brandon's grand, glowing farmhouse. I didn't answer it. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. It rang again immediately. This time, the caller ID showed Brandon's name. I let it ring again. On the third attempt, I calmly reached out, picked up the phone, and swiped the screen. I didn't say hello. I just held the phone to my ear and listened to the sound of my son-in-law's frantic, ragged breathing. Yolanda? Yolanda, is that you? Brandon's voice, usually as smooth and polished as a new marble countertop, sounded thin and frayed at the edges. In the background, I could hear the muffled, chaotic sounds of the farmhouse, the sharp, defensive pitch of Victoria's voice demanding to know what was happening, the clinking of silverware being cleared in a hurry, and a low, frantic murmur that I knew belonged to my daughter, Chloe. I'm here, Brandon, I said, keeping my voice as calm and steady as the mountain waters of the Watauga River. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm stoneware of the yellow mug against my palms. I'm sitting right here at my kitchen table. Yolanda, please tell me this is some kind of sick holiday joke, Brandon stammered, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Our real estate attorney, Richard Vance, he just called us. He was in the middle of his own family dinner, Yolanda. He said a priority alert just hit his firm's portal. A notice of reverter has been filed against our property deed. He said the bank's automated compliance system flagged our construction loan. They've frozen our final draw account. The landscaping crew and the custom iron gate installers are scheduled for Monday morning, and the bank just locked the funds. What the hell did you do? I leaned back in my chair, looking at the soft amber light reflecting off the worn pine of my table. I didn't do anything, Brandon. You did. I simply filed the paperwork that reflects the choices you and Chloe made. What choices? Brandon's voice cracked, rising an octave. We built you a room. We let you live here. You can't just steal our house because of a family argument. We've put over $1 million into this place. You didn't build me a room, Brandon. You built yourself an executive lounge where you could drink scotch with your country club friends, and you shoved me into a damp basement next to a rumbling water heater. And tonight, you locked the basement door from the inside, cutting off my access to the main house, while your wife told me that the real family sits at the dining table. In the state of North Carolina, that is the textbook definition of constructive eviction. It is a direct and material breach of the restrictive covenants we signed 2 years ago. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the phone line. For 35 years at the county registry, I had watched men like Brandon think they could bluster and bully their way out of contracts because they had expensive suits and loud voices. They always forgot that the law doesn't care about your volume. The law only cares about the ink. Let me explain the math to you, Brandon, since I know you prefer real estate buzzwords to actual legal reading, I continued, my voice dropping into that quiet, authoritative tone I used when correcting sloppy title filings at the courthouse. The deed of gift I signed was conditional. It was contingent upon you providing me with an exclusive, uninterrupted 800-square-foot residential unit. By converting that unit into your personal office, and by locking me out of the basement tonight, you triggered the condition subsequent. The moment Frank Miller filed that notice of reverter with the Register of Deeds tonight, the title to those 6 acres automatically reverted back to me, in fee simple, absolute. Do you know what that means? There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Brandon's heavy, nervous breathing. It means, I said softly, that as of 6:45 this evening, you are trespassing on my land. And because you no longer hold clear title to the property, Your $1.2 million construction to permanent loan with Piedmont Trust is in immediate default. Under Section 9 of your mortgage agreement, the bank has the right to accelerate the entire balance of the loan. You have 30 days to pay them $1.2 million, or they will foreclose. You can't do that, Brandon whispered, the arrogance completely drained from his voice. My father's development company personally guaranteed that note. If the bank forecloses, it will ruin his credit. It will ruin our business. We'll lose everything. Then I suggest you start packing, I said. Before Brandon could answer, I heard the sound of the phone being violently snatched away. Mom, are you out of your mind? It was Chloe. Her voice was hysterical, thick with tears and a sharp, ugly anger that made my stomach turn. I closed my eyes for a brief second, remembering the little girl who used to hold my hand when we walked through the autumn leaves on the ridge. How had we gotten here? How had the sweet child I raised turned into this cold, status-obsessed stranger? Mom, you are ruining my life, Chloe sobbed into the receiver. Over a chair? Over a seat at the table? You're going to destroy my marriage and take away my home because your feelings were hurt? Victoria is mortified. She's packing her things right now to go to a hotel in Asheville. She says she's never been so embarrassed in her life. How could you do this to your own daughter? I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of my quiet kitchen fill my lungs. I know some of you listening to this right now, I said, speaking directly to the quiet souls who have sat in the dark, wondering how their own children became their tormentors, have faced this exact moment. You've faced the guilt. They make you feel like you're the monster for finally standing up and saying, no more. They treat you like a doormat for years, and then they scream at you for getting dirt on their shoes when you finally move. If you're standing at that crossroads tonight, let me tell you something. Do not blink. Do not let their tears wash away the truth of how they treated you when they thought you had no power. I gripped the black plastic receiver tighter. Chloe, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the anger she was trying to bait me into. I didn't ruin your life. I didn't embarrass you. You did that all on your own. For 2 years, I have washed your dishes, folded your laundry, and swept your floors. I watched you treat me like an unpaid servant in front of your wealthy friends. I slept next to a noisy water heater while my husband's land, the land he sweated and bled for, was used to finance your luxury lifestyle. And tonight, you stood up in front of a room full of strangers and told me I wasn't part of the real family. You drew the line, Chloe. I'm just standing on my side of it. But Mom, we can fix this, she pleaded, her voice shifting instantly from anger to desperation, a manipulative tactic she had used since she was a teenager. We'll move Brandon's office. We'll hire a contractor tomorrow to expand the basement. We'll give you whatever you want. Just call Frank and tell him to withdraw the notice. Please, Mom, for the sake of your grandson, for Leo. The mention of Leo's name sent a sharp pain through my chest, but as if on cue, my cell phone, which was still sitting on the pine table next to my landline, lit up with a text message. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was from Leo. I'm in my room, Grandma. I'm proud of you. I packed my bag. Can I come stay with you at the duplex? I don't want to be in this house anymore. A tear welled in my eye, but this time it wasn't a tear of grief. It was a tear of profound relief. I had an ally. My sweet grandson, the only one in that house who still had a compass pointing north, was safe. Leo is already taken care of, Chloe, I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. He's packing his bags, and he is coming to stay with me tonight. He's the only one in that house who knows what family actually means. Mom, please, Chloe sobbed. Goodbye, Chloe, I said quietly. I set the heavy receiver back onto its cradle, ending the call. The silence of my kitchen rushed back in. But it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clean. It felt like the crisp mountain air after a summer storm has washed all the dust off the hemlock trees. I sat there for a long moment, watching the steady rise of steam from my kettle, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. Leo's knock on my front door had come just after midnight. When I opened it, the mountain wind was howling, whipping dry oak leaves across the porch. He stood there in his oversized black hoodie, shivering, holding a battered green canvas duffel bag with a broken zipper. His cheeks were bright red from the cold, and his eyes were downcast. I didn't ask him any questions. I didn't make him explain or apologize for his mother. I just stepped aside, took his heavy bag, and pulled him into a tight, warm hug that smelled of the lavender soap I keep in the guest bathroom. "I've got the flannel sheets on the spare bed, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair, "and the heater is humming. You're safe." He had just nodded, his shoulders shaking slightly as he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since dinner. We didn't talk about the farmhouse, or the empty chair, or the look on Chloe's face when I walked out. We just sat at my pine kitchen table, and I warmed up a mug of apple cider with a cinnamon stick. We sat in a comfortable, healing silence until his eyelids grew heavy. The next morning, the sun rose sharp and bright over the frosted ridges, casting long blue shadows across the valley. I was up before the crows, standing at my stove in my favorite faded cardigan. The kitchen was filled with the rich, comforting sizzle of thick-cut bacon and eggs frying in my seasoned cast-iron skillet. Leo came pad-padding down the hallway in his socks, the smell of buttered toast drawing him in. "Morning, Grandma," he said, his voice cracking slightly with teenage fatigue. "Morning, my boy," I said, sliding a plate piled high with food in front of him. "Eat up, we have a busy day ahead of us." If you've ever had someone look at you and think that because your hair is gray and your hands are lined with arthritis, your mind has gone soft, then you know the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong. They think we live in the past. They think we're just relics who sit in rocking chairs, waiting for them to throw us a crumb of attention. They forget that the only reason they have a present is because we spent our past laying the bricks. At 9 o'clock, the landline phone on my wall rang. I didn't even have to guess who it was. I let it ring twice before picking it up. "Yolanda," Frank Miller's gravelly voice came through the receiver. "Richard Vance, Brandon's family attorney, has been blowing up my office phone since 7 this morning. He's sweating through his monogrammed shirt, Yolanda. He knows they're in a corner. He wants an emergency sit-down. I told him we'd meet them at my office on Main Street at 10. Are you ready?" I looked over at Leo, who was quietly washing his plate in the sink, his movements careful and respectful. I felt a surge of that deep, quiet strength that only comes when you know you are protecting the people who actually love you. "I'm ready, Frank," I said. "We'll be there." The drive to Main Street was quiet. Watauga County was bustling with Black Friday shoppers, people rushing in and out of the local boutiques and coffee shops, entirely unaware of the quiet storm brewing above the old hardware store. I parked my 12-year-old Subaru in the gravel lot behind Frank's building. Leo climbed out, carrying his duffel bag, refusing to leave it in the car. He walked beside me, his tall, lanky frame a protective shield as we climbed the squeaking wooden stairs to the second floor. Frank's office was exactly as it had been for 40 years. The walls were lined with heavy, buckram-bound legal reporters, and the air smelled of peppermint, old paper, and floor wax. Frank was sitting behind his massive oak desk, a fresh yellow legal pad in front of him. He stood up when we walked in, his eyes softening as he looked at me, then at Leo. "Yolanda." "Leo, come on in," Frank said, shaking Leo's hand with a firm, respectful nod. "Sit down. They're already in the conference room. They've been here for 20 minutes, and Victoria has already complained twice about the drafts." "Let them complain, Frank," I said, smoothing my wool skirt as I sat in one of the leather armchairs. "The cold is good for clearing the head." Frank led us through the heavy, solid oak door into the adjoining conference room. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, so heavy you could have cut it with a butter knife. Brandon was pacing by the window, his pastel polo shirt replaced by a dark gray designer sweater that didn't quite hide the damp sweat patches under his arms. Chloe sat at the long mahogany table, her eyes red and swollen, a mountain of crumpled tissues resting next to her designer handbag. Beside her sat Victoria, draped in a dark mink coat despite the indoor heating, her face frozen in a mask of pure, aristocratic outrage. At the end of the table sat Richard Vance, a slick 40-year-old attorney with perfectly coiffed hair and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. When I walked in, Chloe stood up, her hand reaching out. "Mom, sit down, Chloe," I said, my voice quiet, flat, and completely devoid of the warmth she was used to manipulating. I didn't look at her. I sat down at the opposite end of the table, placing my worn leather purse neatly in front of me. Leo stood quietly behind my chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on his mother with a steady, unblinking gaze. "Mrs. Vance?" Richard Vance began, clearing his throat and leaning forward, putting on his best boardroom smile. "I'm glad we could gather so quickly. Obviously, there has been a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding here. A family disagreement during a holiday shouldn't escalate into a legal dispute that threatens a multi-million-dollar development project. We're all family here, and we are not all family, Mr. Vance," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his smooth delivery like a sharp frost. I looked directly at Victoria, whose jaw tightened. "And this is not a misunderstanding. It is a title dispute. Let's use the correct terminology." Richard Vance's smile faltered. He looked at Frank, who was sitting back in his chair, slowly unwrapping a peppermint candy with deliberate slowness. "Very well," Richard Vance said, his tone shifting, becoming sharper, more aggressive. "Let's talk about the title. Mrs. Vance, you filed a notice of reverter last night. But let's be realistic. A court of equity in North Carolina is highly reluctant to enforce a forfeiture of this magnitude over what is essentially a domestic squabble. My clients have invested over $1 million of their own funds, secured by a loan, into improving that land. You cannot simply take $1 million structure because you felt excluded at dinner." I let out a soft, dry laugh. I reached into my purse, pulled out a pair of reading glasses, and slipped them onto my nose. From my folder, I pulled out a certified copy of the deed they had signed 2 years ago. "Mr. Vance, I spent 35 years working in the county title registry," I said, tapping my finger on the document. "I have read more property disputes than you have likely drafted in your entire career. If you think this is a simple forfeiture, you haven't read the rider Frank and I attached to this conveyance." I leaned forward, looking Richard Vance dead in the eye. "This is not a standard covenant," I said, my voice steady and measured. "This is a condition subsequent with an automatic right of reverter. The language is explicit. It does not require a court order to execute. The moment the condition is breached, the title reverts automatically by operation of law. The breach occurred when Brandon locked the interior basement doors, denying me access to my designated life estate area, and when they failed to provide the agreed-upon, independent 800-square-foot residential unit, which Brandon has been using as his private office for 14 months. "That's a technicality," Brandon shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You knew about the office. You didn't say anything for a year." "I didn't say anything because I was hoping my daughter would remember her conscience," I said, turning my eyes to Chloe. She flinched, looking down at her lap. "But silence is not waiver, Brandon. Especially not when the deed specifically states that any modification or waiver of the covenants must be in writing, signed by me, and notarized. Do you have a signed waiver from me, Brandon?" Silence fell over the room. Brandon looked at Richard Vance, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. Richard didn't look back at him. He was staring at the deed in his hands, his brow furrowed as he realized the trap had been built with concrete and steel. "And let's talk about Piedmont Trust," I continued, leaning back in my chair. "I know how their commercial lending department operates. I've stamped their loan documents for 3 decades. Under Section 9 of their standard construction to permanent mortgage, any cloud on the title, including a registered dispute or a notice of reverter, constitutes an immediate event of default. The bank doesn't care about your family arguments, Brandon. They care about their collateral. And right now, their collateral belongs to me." Victoria sat up straight, her fingers clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is absurd," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a bitter, ungrateful old woman. We gave you a place to live. We let you stay in our home. You are trying to ruin my son's business over your petty, fragile ego." I looked at Victoria. I looked at the expensive cashmere, the gold rings, the arrogance that she wore like armor. "Victoria," I said softly, "your husband's company, Vance Development, personally guaranteed that $1.2 million note. If Piedmont Trust accelerates the loan, which they will do by Monday afternoon if this notice isn't withdrawn, they will not only foreclose on the house, they will execute the personal guarantee against your husband's business assets. I know this because I personally verified the guarantor files at the courthouse this morning before coming here." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking old and gray in the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. She turned to Richard Vance, her voice rising in panic. "Richard, is this true? Can she do this?" Richard Vance slowly closed his leather folder. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked at Brandon, then at Chloe, and finally at me. "Mrs. Vance," Richard said, his voice losing all of its slick, professional bluster. "What is it that you want?" I looked at my daughter. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperation. She had never seen me like this. She had only ever seen the mother who packed her lunches, who paid her bills, who quietly took the insults and the crumbs of her affection. She had never seen the woman who held the keys to the county. I set down my reading glasses, folded my hands on the table, and prepared to deliver the terms of their survival. I looked around that cold, silent conference room, letting my gaze linger on each of them. I saw the raw, naked panic in Brandon's eyes. I saw the calculated, desperate wheels turning in Richard Vance's legal mind. I saw Victoria, the proud matriarch, suddenly looking very small and very fragile beneath the heavy weight of her dyed mink coat. And finally, I looked at Chloe, my daughter, my baby girl, whose first steps I had cheered in a tiny, rented apartment with nothing but a second-hand sofa and a heart full of hope. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest, a vulnerability that I won't try to hide from you. It hurts to hold your own child accountable. It is a heavy, tearing thing to realize that the only way to save your family's dignity is to be the one who swings the hammer. If you've ever had to stand strong while your heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces, you know exactly what I mean. But I looked at Leo, standing tall and quiet behind my shoulder, and I knew I couldn't blink. "Here are my terms," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy room like a sharp November wind. "And they are not up for negotiation. You have until 5 o'clock today to accept them, or Frank will deliver the formal default notice to Piedmont Trust's regional office in Charlotte." Richard Vance leaned forward, his pen poised over his legal pad. "We are listening, Mrs. Vance." "First," I said, pointing a finger at the deed on the table, "you will buy out my life estate and my interest in the 6 acres. I had the land appraised 6 months ago by the county assessor's office. The bare land, excluding the house you built, is worth $350,000. You will pay me that sum in full by bank wire transfer into an account Frank has already established." Brandon gasped, his face flushing a dark, angry red. $350,000? We don't have that kind of cash sitting around, Yolanda. All our liquidity is tied up in the construction phase. "Then I suggest Victoria's husband writes a check from his corporate account," I replied, not breaking eye contact with Brandon. "Because if he doesn't, his development company will be in default by Tuesday morning, and the bank will take the entire property, house and all. You can do the math on which option costs you more." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but Richard Vance put a hand on her arm, silencing her with a sharp, warning look. He knew I had them dead to rights. "Go on, Yolanda," Frank Miller said quietly, his pen scratching against his yellow pad. "Second," I continued, "that $350,000 will not be mine to spend. It will be placed immediately into an irrevocable educational and housing trust for Leo." I turned my head slightly, looking up at my grandson, whose eyes had gone wide with shock. "The trust will be managed solely by me and Frank. It will pay for Leo's college, his housing, and his future. You will have no access to it, Chloe. Neither will Brandon. You will not touch a single penny of your father's legacy." Chloe let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. "Mom, please. You're treating me like a stranger." "You treated me like a servant, Chloe," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I am simply treating you like a business partner who breached a contract." I took a deep breath, the smell of Frank's peppermint tea grounding me. "Third, Leo is coming to live with me at my duplex. We will execute a voluntary physical custody and residency agreement today. He will finish high school in town, and you will not interfere with his school, his life, or his choices. You will sign the paperwork before you leave this room. And finally," I said, closing my folder with a firm, decisive snap, "you will pay all of Frank's legal fees for the drafting and filing of these documents. Once the wire transfer clears and the custody agreement is signed, I will execute a release of the right of reversion and a quitclaim deed, clearing your title with Piedmont Trust. You will keep your beautiful $1 million farmhouse, but you will never, under any circumstances, ask me to step foot on that mountain again." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on Frank's worn pine floorboards. Brandon looked at Richard Vance, his voice cracking. "Richard, tell me we can fight this. Tell me there's a loophole." Richard Vance slowly let out a long sigh, capping his expensive fountain pen. He didn't look at Brandon. He looked at Victoria. "If they proceed with the reverter, Piedmont Trust will accelerate the loan. Your husband's company is the personal guarantor, Victoria. The bank will freeze your corporate assets within 48 hours to protect their position. The litigation to fight this would take years, and you would lose. Yolanda Vance knows the county land records better than any judge in this district. She's built a watertight case. My professional advice? Sign the papers. Write the check." Victoria slumped back in her chair, the haughty, aristocratic air completely evaporating from her face. She looked older, suddenly, stripped of the illusion of absolute power that her money had always provided. She slowly reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, and dialed her husband. Chloe was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking. She looked across the table at me, her eyes begging for some sign of the mother who had always forgiven her, the mother who had always made excuses for her selfishness. I looked back at her, and my heart wept too. But I did not reach out. I did not soften. I know some of you listening to my voice right now are waiting for me to say that I took the money, threw it in their faces, and walked away completely. I want to say to you, sitting here at my kitchen table, but real life isn't a movie. In real life, we have to build bridges for the innocent, even while we burn the ones that lead to our tormentors. I had to protect Leo. I had to make sure Arthur's hard work went to the child who actually valued the dirt it was built on. It took 4 hours of tense, quiet drafting. Frank's typewriter clicked and clacked in the outer office as his assistant prepared the modified deed of release, the trust agreements, and the residency paperwork. Brandon and Victoria sat in bitter, frozen silence, while Chloe occasionally tried to catch my eye, only to look away when she met my steady, unyielding gaze. At precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, Frank's phone rang. He picked it up, listened for a moment, and then nodded at me. "The wire transfer has cleared, Yolanda. $350,000 is sitting in the Watauga County Trust account for Leo." "Very well," I said. One by one, the documents were passed around the table. Brandon signed with the aggressive, jagged scribble. Chloe's hand shook so badly her signature was almost illegible, damp with her tears. Victoria signed as the corporate witness, her face tight and pale. When it was my turn, I picked up my old vintage fountain pen, the one Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary. I signed my name, Yolanda Vance, with the same neat, flowing cursive I had used on thousands of county deeds for 35 years. I pressed my heavy brass notary seal onto the paper, the mechanical thump sounding like the closing of a heavy iron door. It was over. They left first. Brandon didn't say a word, grabbing his coat and marching out of the office, his boots loud on the wooden stairs. Victoria followed him, her mink coat swishing, her chin held high in a desperate attempt to cling to her shattered pride. Chloe lingered by the door. She looked at Leo, who was standing beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. Are you really not coming home?" Leo looked at his mother. There was no anger in his face, only a quiet, mature sadness that no 15-year-old boy should have to carry. "I am home, Mom," he said softly. "I'm staying with Grandma." Chloe closed her eyes, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. She looked at me, her lips parting as if to say something, to offer some apology, some explanation. But she saw the quiet, unbreakable boundary in my eyes, and she knew there were no words left to bridge the chasm she had dug. She turned and walked out, closing the heavy oak door behind her. The room was quiet again. The smell of peppermint and old paper settled over us like a comforting blanket. Frank Miller let out a long, slow breath, leaning back in his squeaking leather chair. "Well, Yolanda, you did it. Arthur would be damn proud of you today." "I hope so, Frank," I said, wiping a solitary tear from my cheek. "I really hope so. That was 6 months ago." The winter has passed, and the spring has finally come to the Blue Ridge foothills. The wild dogwoods are blooming in delicate white and pink bursts across the ridges. and the mountain air smells of damp earth, fresh grass, and new beginnings. Leo is thriving. He's doing well in his new school in town, his grades are up, and he's joined the track team. Every afternoon, he comes home to my little duplex, his sneakers muddy, his face bright with a smile I hadn't seen in years. We sit at my worn pine kitchen table, and we do his homework together, the steam from my yellow kettle humming a gentle, peaceful tune in the background. My relationship with Chloe is lukewarm at best. She called me on Easter Sunday. It was a short, awkward conversation. She didn't apologize, and I didn't ask her to. We talked about the weather, about the toddler's new teeth, and about Leo's track meets. It was a fragile, distant bridge built on the ruins of what we used to be. But the door is not completely locked. It is ajar, just a crack, waiting to see if she will ever learn that love is not a transaction, and that family is not a status symbol. I don't go up to the ridge anymore. Brandon and Chloe still live in their beautiful $1 million farmhouse, but the glittering white paint and the black window frames don't bother me. I don't need the mountain to remember Arthur, and I don't need their validation to know who I am. I have my duplex, I have my quiet kitchen, I have my grandson's laughter echoing down the hallway. I've learned that life has a way of balancing the ledgers, if you have the patience to let the pages turn. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to raise your hand to defend your dignity. Sometimes, the greatest power you have is simply knowing your worth, holding your ground, and letting the ink do the talking. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, looking out the kitchen window at the bright green leaves of the maples swaying in the morning breeze. It is a beautiful day in Watauga County, a beautiful, quiet day to be home.